Welcome to The Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. Today we are covering Jeremiah chapter 4 through chapter 29. Just a little background because this book is significantly different from the book of Isaiah. But last week we began to talk about how Jeremiah wrote about 100 years after Isaiah did. And there were other prophets writing at the same time as him as well. There was, for instance, Ezekiel and Daniel and Habakkuk and maybe even Obadiah and Zephaniah, all of which we'll run into later. And these prophets were all writing after the northern tribes had been taken into captivity by Assyria, in fact, like 100 and 150 years later. And so Jeremiah talks a lot about the final days of the kingdom of Judah as its people are taken into captivity, and then into the final stages when the Babylonians actually take Jerusalem, burn it to the ground as well as the temple, and drag everyone into captivity. He talks a lot about what happens in Jerusalem after it falls, how, for instance, Nebuchadnezzar leaves a small group of poor people in the city to take care of it, but that doesn't work out very well, and there's a conflict that happens among the remaining Jews. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of intense conflicts and rivalries and civil wars going on here. What's interesting about the book of Jeremiah is that it starts off with chapters of prophecy that, well, you kind of have to know what's going on for them to make sense. And that is until you reach about chapter 20, where he shifts into more of a historical narrative with his prophecies in the midst of them. So you have historical situations happening, and Jeremiah responding to them with specific prophecies about God's responses to what's happening at that time. And we meet some interesting characters in this book, and so we need to spend some time describing them. Kind of like in a ball game, you want to know who the players are. First, there is Baruch, who is a scribe who writes a lot for Jeremiah. He assists Jeremiah in his messages and sometimes even puts his life on the line to do so. So he's one of the good guys. And then there are several Judean kings who can be hard to keep straight. First, there's King Jehoiakim, who is king from 609 to 698 BC, or 609 to 598 BC. And he's the son of the last great king of Judah, which is King Josiah. And if you remember from 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, Josiah became king at age 8, made reforms by age 18, and put the nation back on the right path, but he was killed in battle around the age of 39 by Necho, Pharaoh of Egypt. So Jehoiakim was not a good king, and his father's reforms were abandoned during his time. And Jeremiah did not have kind words to say to him. He was a king that burned Jeremiah's scrolls, and we'll run into that later. Then there was King Jehoiachin. See, hard to separate. Not Kim, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. And he was king from 598 to 597, basically reigned about 3 months. And he was taken into captivity in chapter 22, and in the end he gets released from prison in Babylon. Kind of a strange fellow. Then last but not least, although not good, was King Zedekiah, who was king from 597 to about 587 BC. He was another son of King Josiah and brother to the first king, Jehoiah. And so he did not follow Jeremiah's advice to give up the city to the Babylonians, and eventually is captured by them, and his children are killed in front of him, and then his eyes are gouged out, and then he dies himself many years later in Babylon in prison. Kind of a tragic figure, but he kind of also brought it on himself. He was warned a lot. Lastly, there's Governor Gedaliah. Now notice he's a governor, not a king. He was appointed to rule Judah for the Babylonians. There was a small group of people left there after it was taken and burned to the ground, and he was supposed to take care of them and watch over the remains of the city, which he started out doing a good job. He was a supporter of Jeremiah, but unfortunately he was assassinated by a man named Ishmael for cooperating with the Babylonians. Again, this civil war that's going on in the midst of that context, much like we see today, right? Now, as we read through the chapters for this week, we find some common themes. For instance, in chapter 7 through 10, Jeremiah tells them that just going to the temple and going through the mechanics of worship is not enough. Worse than that, they're also worshiping idols and even sacrificing their own children. This is how far the nation of Judah has wandered from God. They have thought because they were the chosen people that they could do anything they want and get away with it. God says, no, there's going to be some consequences, some severe consequences for this type of behavior. In chapters 11 through 13, God brings up that because they've broken the covenant, they're going to face his judgment. Meanwhile, Jeremiah is looking at God and saying, well, what are you waiting for? Punish them now. I mean, these people just keep sinning and there seems to be no consequences. What are you waiting for? God says, I want to give them time to repent. He was a gracious, loving God. There is this strange scene with Jeremiah in the loincloth, which is ruined. And God says, my people are the same way. They're like dirty rags. Then there's this jug full of wine, which represents the fullness of God's judgment, and how the people are going to have to be forced to drink it, to drink God's wrath. In chapters 14 and 15, we have the false prophets telling the people, don't worry, there's just peace ahead. Everything's going to be happy. Jeremiah warns the people not to listen to these false prophets, but listen instead to God who's speaking through him and take the warnings seriously. In chapters 16 through 17, God's very clear that he's going to punish the sins of the people by destroying Judah. One of the big factors is that God has great anger for their breaking of the Sabbath. Not only were they worshiping false idols, but they were doing commerce on the Sabbath. In chapters 18 through 20, the people reject God by punishing Jeremiah instead of listening to him. This judgment is proclaimed by Jeremiah breaking a clay vessel, saying this is what he's going to do to Jerusalem. Jeremiah also feels that God, again, is not doing enough to punish the people, and that because of that, he's being punished by the people. I mean, they're imprisoning him and beating him and stuff like that, and he complains to God because it seems unfair. In chapters 21 through 24, we start to see more of this narrative story happening and the prophecies being carried out in real time. God tells the people in Jerusalem that Nebuchadnezzar is God's pagan servant and that they need to surrender to him and be taken into captivity, that this captivity is God's will for them. In the process, God promises a new and righteous king who will reign over them and protect them forever. And of course, this is pointing to Jesus. God also says he will protect his people when they are in exile, but he will punish those who refuse to go into exile and instead remain in Jerusalem. In chapters 25 through 29, God warns his people that he's soon going to destroy Jerusalem and that ultimately his judgment will fall on all nations, including Babylon. Jeremiah, meanwhile, is arrested for treason because he's been saying bad things against the nation and calling them to repent of their sins and saying that if they do that, God will forgive them. Sound familiar? Eventually, Jeremiah is let loose. Then we have the false prophet Hananiah, who falsely predicts the return of the temple furnishings which have been taken to Babylon earlier. It's all good news again. God says, though, if you rebel and stay in Jerusalem, you will suffer. But if you surrender and go into exile, I will protect you. As you can see, Jeremiah, at least I think, is much more interesting to read than Isaiah, although Isaiah has much grander gospel promises. We see this narrative intensify next week in the last half of the book of Jeremiah. So keep reading because it gets even more exciting, intense. Next week we'll cover Jeremiah chapter 30 through Jeremiah chapter 50. So thank you for joining us for the Road to Jesus with Pastor Fred here at St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana. We'll see you next week. Peace out.